Hello and welcome to this book club of the Lotus Eaters. I'm Harry, joined today by Josh.
Hello.
And today we're going to be taking a look at this, The Grey Lady Winked, How the New York Times Misreporting, Distortions and Fabrications Radically Alter History by Ashley Rindsberg. So I understand you've literally just got finished reading this or listening to it.
Listening to it. So you've actually read the physical book and I've listened to the audio book. So we've got kind of both bases covered there.
Yes. How did you find the narration, just for anyone who might be interested in listening to it?
Well, I listened to the Audible version and it was a very dispassioned American lady reading it. And
okay.
It meant that I basically had to listen to it on 1.5 times speed to be able to tolerate listening to her. However, the content of the book redeemed it.
Yes.
I feel like the narration didn't do it justice because the actual content was interesting, and despite the
occasional mixed message that was going on in it. Yes, and just to get into it, as you can probably tell from the title, the book is examining the New York Times long track record of misreporting facts and distorting information that's from all across the world for the past over a century at this point. He talks about, it's primarily a journalistic piece. It's got a decent level of history in it as well to give context to a lot of the journalists and the events that they're covering that he talks about throughout the book. As far as I can tell, the history seems to be reasonably well reported, would you say?
Well, there's some aspects of it where I think, well, it would be nice to have a bit more information to back up some of the claims, because he's talking about these journalists, for example, taking things through secondary sources, taking information and reporting it through hearsay, and then does exactly that himself sometimes. And I was just a little bit struck by that. However, a lot of the things they did say, I at least knew, my understanding was that it was correct. I didn't hear anything. I was just like, oh, that doesn't sound right necessarily. So a lot of the actual history setting things up does sound right. However, it's a weird juxtaposition where they're talking about these journalistic practices where they're not backing up what they're saying with evidence, and then they list off loads of historical claims. Like, I was really struck by talking about people in like the 1940s, and they're like, yeah, they were just as snappily dressed as they were. And I was like, you've not met this person. How can you make claims like that?
I think to a certain extent, the book could have probably done with some more sourcing in that case, because if saying something like that, all you really need is a source for like maybe a first-hand account of meeting those sorts of people. It does come across more like the sort of prose to make it a bit more dynamic to read rather than reporting the information.
I got the impression that they were a little bit partial to either reading or writing a bit of literature, because there was a little bit of that
that's
sprinkled in there, really.
That's the interesting thing. The author, just to give a little bit of background on him, Ashley Rindsberg, is a relatively, I would say, unknown quantity over here in the West. As far as I could tell, I'd never heard of him before this book came out, or before I heard of the book through watching Adam and Sitch, and Adam mentioned it, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. But he was born in South Africa, raised in the US, and currently lives in Israel. Since he's lived in Israel, he did write one other book called Tel Aviv Stories, which, as far as I can tell, is a fictional piece of work. So that may be where some of his more unfounded flourishes of prose originate from, his love of writing fiction, I imagine. As far as I can tell with the author himself, I couldn't really learn that much about him on an individual level, maybe his positions on certain things, beyond just reading the book, primarily because the interviews that I found with him were focused entirely on his process for researching and writing this book, and nothing really on his personal background. But as the book kind of makes a point to say over and over again, it's probably best a lot of the times that the author does not, or the journalist does not, overshadow the stories that they're reporting on, because that is a problem that we find time and time again with the New York Times, as far as I can tell.
Well, I think it necessarily depends on what you're trying to do with your journalism. If it's something that's still yet unclear, and there are no facts of the matter, you should acknowledge your own position and be upfront about it, which is something that I think we do here quite a lot, where we're just like, well, we don't know the full facts, but here's what we think, sort of thing. Well,
that's just an element of transparency with your own work.
And I think that some more of that, and not putting oneself as being perfectly objective, because I don't think anyone can
No,
be
of course not.
perfectly objective, or you can't be perfectly neutral either. I just feel like it's a fool's errand to do so, and it's very difficult.
Well, I would say that he certainly doesn't seem to try and be perfectly neutral throughout the book. He definitely inserts some of his own opinions in there, even if they can be a little bit conflicting at times. But yeah, so basically one of the main points of the book, just to cover some of the general aspects of it, is that the New York Times, as we know it at the moment, we would probably consider it to be activist journalism, when you've got stuff like the 1619 Project, which they cover in this book, that is very much trying to reframe and reposition certain elements of history to be more important than one another in a sort of attempt to push a current social message.
I'm not sure whether you want to talk a bit more about that, or whether I'm going to spoil a subsequent section here, but...
Well, to be fair, I'm going to focus primarily on 3 of the journalists, or 4 of the journalists.
Okay.
Nicole Hannah-Jones and her 1619 Project was not one of them. So if you would like to just get into a little bit of that right now, that's no problem.
Sure. I'm sure most of you probably heard about it, at least in passing, that they're trying to make slavery the central narrative of the American history, that America didn't actually start in 1776. It was, of course, 1619. Everyone knows
when the
that.
first slave ship arrived, which is definitely the exact date where it arrived. Please don't ask historians about that.
Well, the funny thing is, in the book, they mention that the historians very much push back on it, and
not just the historians who weren't involved with the project, the historians who were directly involved in advising the journalists who were writing all of the essays that would appear in the 1619 Project issue of the New York Times, came back and said, no, I told them not to do any of this. I told them they were just being completely incorrect. And the thing is, those historians were all obviously left-leaning, because they all sounded very sympathetic to the cause of what they were trying to do. But I respect that their dedication to historical accuracy seems to have won out over whatever political leanings that they may have had to a certain extent, because they're all going, well, none of this is true. We literally have the writings from the founding fathers to tell us exactly why they formed America, and it had nothing to do with maintaining slavery.
Yeah, they were basically trying to outline, okay, we're sympathetic that you're trying to look at slavery and things like that, because they spoke to lots of people who had specialised in that area. However, even the most fervent left-wing historians were just like, yeah, that's not really true. And then eventually, I think it was about 3 weeks later, the New York Times begrudgingly published a letter from historians just like, yes, this was a load of rubbish.
Yes, if I remember correctly, correct me on this, because once again, I read it maybe a week ago on the page, and you've only just listened to it, so it's obviously a lot fresher in your mind. Didn't they post that sort of editorial as an editorial note somewhere buried within the paper? Whereas
they like doing that, yeah.
Yeah, it really should have been a front page thing to say, okay, we need to clarify some things, but they're like, put it maybe page 7, page 8, where people who are flicking through the paper aren't really going to be paying as much attention, just to retract some of the things that we may have said.
Yeah, they have a habit of, whenever they make a mistake, they will hide it as much as possible. Or if there's something that doesn't look good optically for the newspaper, a story that maybe makes them look bad, then they'll be like, well, this would be front page news, but we're going to hide it just in case, because, we don't want to damage our own reputation.
But when things do go bad, they kind of have a mixed record of maybe at times going far too far in defending the journalists who were implicated in whatever wrongdoing they did or misreporting, and then also alternately throwing them completely under the bus and firing them when the week before they were defending them.
Yeah, it seems very much like the New York Times has always had a practice of defending their journalists when it's expedient for the company to do so. So they preserve their public image, but then as soon as the Eye of Sauron is away from them, they're just like, yes, under the bus for you.
Yeah.
And it's pretty obvious from the multiple stories here of these journalists doing underhanded things that you get an impression of how it's been run and is still run to this day.
Yeah, not just underhanded things independent of the upper management and publishers, but also hand in hand with the publishers. And in one particularly shocking example, when they're talking about how the New York Times tried to cover up elements of the nuclear bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the nuclear fallout happened there that was poisoning people, how they had done so hand in hand with the publisher and the government themselves, the US government, to try and prevent any form of negative press being put towards the development of nuclear weapons.
I felt like that was one of the weaker aspects of the book in a way. There are lots of really compelling stories there that go all the way back to the early 20th century, talking about the mid-century Germans and the Soviets and the famine and all things of that nature. It is a really good look, particularly further into the past, of things that the New York Times has reported that have been factually incorrect. And obviously our knowledge today is largely based on what we have lived through ourselves in terms of misreporting. And it's nice to actually have a historic view going back that far.
Mm-hmm. What was your point about the nuclear bombing being one of the weaker sections?
I got lost. But no, I think it was a time where the US government was actively trying to get newspapers to be on side, right? There was the wartime propaganda, and they certainly had to toe a certain line. It wasn't necessarily like they had complete creative freedom, and when it was of matters of, this new top secret weapon, they didn't necessarily want to get on the US government's bad side about it, because they could have actually there's still some blame to apportion here.
That is true, but I don't think that sort of absconds them of any responsibility for their journalistic reporting, especially when they make a point that at the same time there was another reporter within the New York Times, because it was all of these stories were reported on primarily by one reporter who, if I get the name up on my documents here, William L. Lawrence.
He was the science correspondent,
yes.
wasn't he?
Ironically, in one of those sort of cosmic coincidences that happens, William L. Lawrence was reporting and trying to cover up that there was the nuclear fallout killing people in Japan when people were returning, because the US government was trying to tell everybody that it was only the explosion that kills people, there's no after effects, and then 3 weeks later you still had people where they were giving birth to deformed babies, people just dropping dead with no particular symptoms. A man called William H. Lawrence, also a reporter for the New York Times, simultaneously went to Japan and was reporting the facts on the ground, saying that, there are people who are coming up with these strange symptoms we've never seen before, dropping dead. And then the New York Times got him to basically retract that a few weeks later, didn't they?
Yeah, it's not necessarily good, but in the vast scheme of all of their bad stuff, I feel like this one is the lesser of the two, because the link, they basically, the author tries to link it between...
I suppose, to be fair, as we'll cover as we move forward, the New York Times reporting propaganda from their own government makes a nice change.
Yes, that's probably what I'm trying to say. And also it was in a time of war, which changes it a little bit. You could contrast that to them basically propelling Fidel Castro from a guerrilla in the mountains, which sounds really weird, as in he was fighting the government, not he was crawling around on all fours.
Yes, that was an interesting sort of tidbit to cover as well. Just to sort of skirt over some of the ones that I wasn't going to cover in this. Yes, there was the interesting story of how one of the reporters for the New York Times tracked down Fidel Castro when he was, like you say, a guerrilla in the mountains in Cuba, and was able to sort of propel his public image and sort of put him forward as this anti-communist hero, which was very ironic, looking ahead, who was fighting against the evil and corrupt Batista regime, and pushed his image that much forward compared to where it was, that in his later years, after obviously he became the dictator of Cuba, Fidel Castro made multiple journeys to the New York Times headquarters so he could thank them. Yes,
and just to highlight how significant this was, before they reported on him and made him basically a household name, he himself claimed that he was just a man with about 18 soldiers. He's basically a bandit in the mountains, right?
Yeah.
And to fool the New York Times reporter, he just got his own 18 men to walk around in circles to give him the illusion that he had more men than he really did. And the New York Times reporter was more than willing to lap it up and report on it and make out like he was the resistance against Batista.
Yes, and you can see there how for the journalist himself, obviously it probably took a lot of effort to track down where Fidel was. They don't really, Ashley doesn't really go into much detail about how he managed to track him down, as far as I remember. But that must have taken a lot of effort. But then the journalistic standards held after that of not noticing, hey, these are just the same 18 guys wandering about constantly, sort of points to the fact that, one, the journalist probably had his own opinions on what was going on that he wanted to push Fidel as this larger-than-life angelic hero.
Well,
and
he
at
also,
the same time...
he also wanted to push him as pro-democracy and basically the anti-communist candidate, which really propelled his popularity and actually really helped him recruit, get more funding, he got more publicity. So the fact that he thanked the New York Times, obviously, it was a symbolic thing and a consolidation of his power, but also I think there is a certain amount of gratitude towards them as being one of the main forces in his success. And in their misreporting, they actively propelled him to the top. And this is one of the most egregious cases where you're just like, yes, this is clear that their reporting clearly had real world effects.
Yes, I mean,
that are obviously negative.
I think there was a quote from Castro himself where he stated, I wouldn't have been able to do this without the New York Times reporting. I wouldn't be where I am today. Something to that effect. So, as you say, yes, absolute definite real world consequences coming from massive misreporting and sort of not willful distortion of the facts. Well, maybe willful, you could say, because he was sort of acting on willful ignorance. Because
he was painting him as a somewhat religious figure, when really he was just abandoned in the mountains.
Let me just get the name up for that particular...
Name and shame him, that's a good idea. But the reason I mentioned this is I'm contrasting it against the nuclear story, because that one, I feel like the link was quite tenuous to the actual consequences of the misreporting, because they do a reasonably good job of implicating what the consequence of the Times misreporting something is. And I feel like a lot of the cases are quite compelling. That nuclear weapons one was the least compelling, because I don't think the behaviour of the US government is necessarily going to be shaped that much by the reporting of the New York Times. Whereas,
well, no, I would say that the New York Times, they actually makes a point to point out that, especially in the 1940s, did have a massive level of influence throughout the country, which is primarily due to them being the most syndicated paper in the country. I forget if it was the 1930s or the 40s. They were syndicated across 525 newspapers across the country, which anyone who doesn't know what that means is it means that they basically sell off the right to publish stories written by New York Times journalists that are published in the New York Times to different newspapers across the country. So if it was front page news on the New York Times, if they sell that off, it means that other papers also have the right, if they buy that, to publish that story, probably on the front page of theirs as well.
Similar
so it gets
to
across
what,
the whole country.
Reuters do now.
Yes. But that level of influence, when it was the point of they didn't want a big public pushback against any humanitarian issues that there might be with nuclear bombs and the after effects and what it does to people, I would say definitely does have an effect, because they were trying to paint the story in a positive light, saying, oh, this is just a coincidence, nothing's going on, whereas if they'd actually reported it factually, then people may have pushed back against it.
I'm not necessarily saying that it had no impact whatsoever, right?
Yeah, no.
But it's lesser when compared to some of the other stuff, like, for example, just not reporting on the Holocaust and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. We'll get to that.
I won't spoil it.
We went off on a massive tangent. Basically, my original point that I was going to make was that we think of the New York Times as activist journalism nowadays, when reading through this, the reality of the matter is the fact that they have always been activist journalists.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.